I think we should also talk about some of the things around unionization, because that has been a question mark around what could be done, at least legally, in terms of enforcing this. Because if the Players Association had already become a union, and I know there are many challenges, among them player education, which we've discussed previously, then this might be a very different scenario where you could actually strike, which means that nobody could work as long as the majority of the people within the union voted to go on strike, right? And you could hold out. You also had plenty of opportunities, not you necessarily, you are relatively new, but the players had many opportunities to unionize, which of course would have set up the potential for a salary cap within the league. And I know unionization is difficult because unlike in traditional sports where there's two entities, a team-owned league and the players, there's a weird third entity in Riot that exists that would have to be bargained with as well, which makes things a lot more complicated. But at the same time, I find it somewhat hard to sympathize for the players while they spent years guzzling this venture capital to the tune of millions of dollars of getting paid, and they didn't bother to set a salary floor because they thought the tap of VC would just continue gushing forth until the end of time. So why not just make as much money as possible in the short term? It does seem to me to be a lack of vision from the players themselves that has somewhat caused this situation.
There's someone in this chat who literally tried to make a player union in Counter-Strike.
A very challenging thing to do across multi.
Maybe Richard can tell us, why can't you do it, Richard?
Well, there's so many legal. First of all, you've got countries have different laws about unions. So one of the first barriers was understanding jurisdictional components to it, because if somebody, let's say, is Danish and that's where they apply their labor, and I've got another player who's German, we can't necessarily find that, they've got different labor laws. So that was a problem. Then they
work for a German team and they play in France.
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously where you travel to ply your trade also can throw up labor issues. So there was that. Then the other problem was that as soon as you call yourself a union, particularly in America, you have to comply with a bunch of legal standards that are very, very hard. Like, essentially, I was plunged into immediately being told, if you call yourself a union, you better retain counsel. You're going to need lawyers. You're going to need all this problem. You're going to, they're going to have to solve all these legal problems. And it was just like, okay, well, I guess if we're an association. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. That doesn't actually mean shit. It's like probably why, again, we have to say stuff like strikes, walkouts. Stuff. Another problem was in America, when you unionize, it comes with some caveats. Like, for example, I think to have a player union in a league, that comes with, like, you have to have a functional players association. There's like salary things attached to it. You suddenly open to like antitrust and all this other stuff. It was like, and obviously I'm not American, so it was like super complicated. And then in Europe, trying to just pull together all these disparate countries with very different attitudes towards labor laws, in particular, say, even just UK and France, which is like a tiny little fucking, like it's a 50-minute plane ride away, but the laws are very, very different. It just wasn't practical. And so I laid the bedrock for an association, and then ultimately it didn't go anywhere because players didn't want to acquiesce to having non-current players be their reps. I was still, even though it was an association, I was still setting it up with the union model where you pay money into the system, you pay your subs, you pay your fees, because I used to be a shop steward, I used to be a union rep, and then that money goes into a slush fund, and then if we need any legal help or whatever, or someone loses their job, we can take out of it. That was going to be the model, but also that came with, you have a rep, and he's not a current player, so he's not into the politics and the bullshit, and players didn't want to go for that. They were happy going back to the Skype group days. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard, and CS has one particular advantage. It has all those disadvantages, and it had one advantage, which is that developers very hands-off and allows the third parties, by and large, to operate, which is a key thing we don't have here. The developer in Riot, as we all have seen by these actions that happens in this call and everything else, they control everything. And on paper, they are not an employer of our players. If we were to go under traditional unionization, we'd be unionizing against the teams.
Yes.
And the reality is that Riot is the group that we need to be unionized against. They must be enjoined within that in order for it to be successful. And there is, in this most recent year, we have a precedent from the NLRB around college sports that provides some window into a world where that could happen in the future. In our previous conversation, that hadn't existed yet, and we had no legal precedent. There's a first step. It's not a one-to-one, but basically the NLRB said that the Pac-12, USC, and the NCAA were all joint employers of these collegiate athletes, and that they could all be enjoined in collective bargaining. And that's really something that we needed to exist, and it's still a very complicated process. The reality, and it is no secret here, I have talked with Riot behind the scenes about what it would look like to unionize, and that we would need Riot to be in the process, because at the end of the day, they're giving the millions, they're turning into player dollars for contracts. There's a big pass-through going here. They're creating the league, they're running the operation, they're putting together the broadcast, they're going to find the sponsors, they're giving the money to the teams that goes to the players, right? At the end of the day, they're doing most everything. And Riot has indicated to us clearly that if we were to unionize and we were to try and join them, that they would fight like tooth and nail, which makes that an incredibly expensive and long process. We would end up in court for a long time, spend a lot of dollars we don't have. And that's a real challenge. And we've been working to try and get to a place where we could actually perceivably get there. We launched and talked to you a year ago about our group rights program. That now sits in limbo because of Riot as well. We continue to work behind the scenes on that, but God only knows if they're going to let that get to a place where we can actually be functional. But without a sustainable revenue
what is
stream,
their opposition to you doing that, out of curiosity?
I cannot speak to it. It's a matter that I would not feel comfortable speaking publicly because of private conversations that we will still honor. In spite of Riot lying to us and doing this to us, this is there's a matter here which we would need to maintain privacy on and respect. So I can't get into that, but it is held up right now, and we're continuing to work with them on trying to find the pathway forward, and they continue to indicate that they want to get us on a pathway forward. But until we have a sustainable revenue stream, the capacity to unionize, even against just teams, is a very costly measure, and we would be risking immediate insolvency to do so before we ever even got across the finish line. But at the end of the day, Riot's got to be a part of the process. Like I said it to you guys a year ago, it's the same here. If they're not a part and they're not willing to be a part, the battle becomes brutal, and we would need probably, to make it realistic, we would need somebody willing to go pro bono, like high-end labor firm who'd willing to take it pro bono to make it happen. That's kind of the expectation. Those are the challenges. They're, and that's to say, like, you can say that's, you got to do it, because that's what you got to do. And we try and navigate those things every day, and it's hard.
By the way, is there any more topics along these lines, or do you want to do the thing about the journalism angle? See more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.